Hi, I'm Ken Sterling, and this is my channel. And most of the time, we utilize this channel to talk about Indiana sports, whether it's the Colts, the Hoosiers, the Pacers, Bulldogs, Boilermakers, Cardinals, chirp, chirp, under the tutelage of Michael Lewis. How about those Ball State Cardinals? Anyway, we talk about sports. On Saturdays, I want to do a video every week where we talk about sports media because that's my background and it's interesting to me. And given the number of questions I get about sports media on this channel, I think it's interesting to you too, and maybe it's going to be interesting to people around the country who are either in sports media or looking to get into sports media. Sports media is really interesting, and that's my background. I'm a manager of sports media and sports talk radio. Launched 1070 The Fan here in Indianapolis, hired guys like Dan Dockich, Michael Grady, Eddie White, Bob Kravitz, Matt Taylor, Chris May. We had a really, really good staff. Scott Agnes was an intern for us. I've worked with Scott 3 times. Nick Bozak worked for us. Went to St. Louis, worked at 101 ESPN, and worked with another group of great professionals. And I've learned things about sports media. And one of the things I want to share with you about sports media, I want to talk to you today about the Jockocracy of sports media. That's what Howard Cosell called it. He said that the Jockocracy of sports media was the pairing of an athlete with a trained broadcaster. And broadcasters used to kind of get pissed off at this. They used to get angry about athletes just waltzing into the booth and you throw on a set of headphones and start talking about the game, and all of a sudden they're the guys making all the money. And I get it. It's important to understand why it works, and it's not just a deep understanding of the sport that they're talking about. That's not it. What makes them really good at their jobs, it's 4 things. And a deep understanding of what they're talking about is only one of them. Another is they understand how to prepare. As athletes, you've got to prepare to compete. They understand that. They understand taking time away from the game to prepare to play the game. And to be good at sports media, you've got to do exactly the same thing. You know, they always said in college, and everybody poo-pooed it, they said, you've got to study like 2 hours for every hour you're in class in order to succeed at that class. I thought it was preposterous. Little did I know. But you do have to do exactly that. You've got to prepare to talk to people about an event or about a topic. And if you don't, you're going to sound hollow. And if you sound hollow, people will lose trust in what you're saying. Got to prepare, and athletes understand how to prepare. They don't look at sports media as a dodge. They don't. You got to prepare, and they do. You've got to understand the need to be a good teammate. And that's what a lot of former athletes really miss about playing a sport, is they miss that camaraderie, that sense of team, that sense of a bunch of people pulling on one end of the rope, right? Working in collaboration to bring about a wonderful product that people will consume on their television, their radio, on their, portable device, whatever it is. They like being a teammate, and they work really well with other people. Generally, that's not an inviolable rule, but generally they are really, really good teammates and understand the need to be supportive of one another. And in broadcasting or sports media in general, being cooperative kind of flies in the face of being competitive. And being competitive is what this is about, right? It's not. It's just about putting out a good product. It's not looking at everybody else's numbers. How many subscribers does that guy have? How many listeners does this show have? How many viewers do we have? It's not about that. That's management stuff. That's for the accountants. For those who are performing, for those who are taking part in the process of bringing a performance and a show to people, being a member of a team and being cooperative and not being competitive is really, really important. You don't count the seconds that you're talking and compare that to the seconds that somebody else talks. It's not about that either. Athletes get this at a really high level, and they get it right away. They don't need to be taught that. They are willing to pay dues. They understand. Baseball players understand you got to go to the minors before you go to the majors. Football players understand you got to play in college before you go to the NFL. Basketball players, they understand the concept of the G League or college basketball before they get to the NBA. They get it. They enjoy that part of the process. They know that paying dues is really, really important. And then you get to the crux of it, and the thing that kind of opened the door for former athletes and former coaches, managers, and that is that they have a deep, deep understanding of what they're talking about, deeper than the layman can possibly fathom. I hired Dan Dockich, and I'll tell you why I hired Dan Dockich. Number one, Dan Dockich, and people are like, oh, you're the guy to blame. No. Dan Dockich is really good at doing what he does. And he is that because he's got a bit of a ticking clock in his head. And he understands the need to be engaged at all times. He is never bored. Not in his life, not in his show. And if he's not going to be bored, you're not going to be bored. And that is really critical. And I've known Dan since 1988. And that's always been true with Dan. Dan did a thing on Fox Sports Ohio that I thought was brilliant. And I think he just did it out of boredom. He did a show called Falcon Basketball with Dan Dockich, and it was on Fox Sports Ohio. And I would watch every week because Dan's just funny to me. Dan is always going to be interesting, and he's always going to be funny. So Dan, this particular week, tells the guy who's paid to sit there and interview him, says, hey, I got to tell you the truth. I try to answer or anticipate your questions before we start. And your questions, they're not very good. They're not the ones that I come up with in the car. And I think my questions are better. So today, we're going to debut Dan Asks Dan. And for about 7 minutes, Dan asked himself questions. And it was awesome. It was really, really good. And it was a great radio bit. And I thought, man, in fact, I was watching with my son. I said, Ryan, that's a great radio bit. And I had always told Dan that if he ever needed a job in radio, give me a call. And one day he did. In 2008, after all that went down at IU, you know what? He called and I said, I got an opening. Good timing is key in sports media. If you've got good timing, you can build a career. If you don't have good timing, you can languish forever behind the people that you are more talented than. That's a good lesson to learn. But Dan, from the minute he was on the air, he had good timing, and he understood exactly what he was doing and exactly how he best communicated with listeners. And that made him compelling, really compelling, for 14 years here in Central Indiana at ESPN in Bristol, and still doing really good work on Outkick. Because Dan knows how to communicate and excite. And that's a really good thing. I hired Eddie White. Eddie White now works for the Pacers. Eddie was wonderful. I loved working with Eddie. Eddie understood the need to be interesting, and he understood at a really high level the need to prepare. Had a great understanding of the need to prepare. He was almost like a jock being in the room because he understood team, and he had worked inside the NFL to the point where he had great contacts and understood through preparation. And his preparation was calling guys who knew stuff and talking to them. Eddie got it. Bob Kravitz was awesome. Michael Grady was terrific. And I underestimated Michael for a little bit. He worked as a board op. And I got to tell you, he worked as a board op too long because he was exceptionally talented and remains that as the voice, the radio voice of the Minnesota Timberwolves. In St. Louis, I worked with a bunch of former jocks. Chris Duncan, a really good baseball player for the St. Louis Cardinals, who was hilarious. He was wonderful, and he understood team. DeMarco Farr, same thing, a Pro Bowl defensive tackle with the Rams, got into media, and has done really, really well at it. I loved working with DeMarco. He understood how things needed to come together in order to have, it's just like basketball. We always say this, basketball, you got to play like a fist, right? All the fingers have got to be clenched together. You can't be like this, with 5 players all doing their own thing. DeMarco got that at a really high level. Had Andy Van Slyke, Jason Simontachi, Brian Thompson, all of these guys, they just got it. And you could tell them directly. Some guys You got to be really careful with criticism. Not with former athletes. They get being criticized. Look, if you've been yelled at by Tony La Russa or Dick Vermeil or Bob Knight, you can take being yelled at by some yo-yo like me. That's not going to cause a disruption in your life. You're not going to go home and cry into a pillow because I yelled at you after you've already been dressed down by, the greats who've ever coached or managed. Athletes are really, really good at radio, and they are really, really good in the media for a variety of reasons, and maybe the least of which is their knowledge of the game. It's everything else they do that makes a difference and allows them to build really successful careers. I was in sports media. If you want to get into sports media, you know what? You can DM me on Twitter, and I'll give you the best advice I can. And it's not, don't get into it. People are going to tell you that, but you know what? Some people find their way. And there are common kind of precepts that need to be followed in order to get there. And if you don't, you're going to have real trouble. And if you think it's a dodge to work in sports media, that all you do, if you got a show from noon to 3, is show up at noon and then talk until 3, and then you're done and you can go enjoy your day. You know what? I'll tell you, at about 1:30 that first afternoon, you're going to run out of stuff to say, and you're going to think, wow, this is a lot harder than I thought, and I don't know what the hell I'm talking about for the next 90 minutes. And that's not a pleasant position to be in. It's not pleasant at all to run out of stuff. Prepare for a show that's going to be twice as long as the show you're doing, and you're going to be just fine. If you're doing play-by-play, most people do play-by-play really, really well, but here's what they do. They overtalk, and we'll talk about that in future episodes. And I got to tell you, there are people doing sports radio right now in Indianapolis that ask the longest questions I've ever heard. The object of a question, the purpose of a question, is to elicit an interesting response. That's the purpose of a question. The fewer words it takes to generate that response from a guest, that is art. And it's not being practiced very well here in Indianapolis. It's just not. And I hope that some of the people who are in sports talk radio in Indy listen to this and they understand, I got to shorten my questions. And if you're listening to this and you're wondering, are my questions too long? The answer is yes. We'll talk to you next Saturday about sports media, and all week long, Breakfast with Kent, Inside Indiana Sports Now with Kent Sterling. I can't wait to talk to you then. If you found this interesting, comment. I appreciate it. Subscribe. You can like the video too, and that's a wonderful thing. And we're, as always, brought to you by the great people at BUSR, busr.com/Kent. Your initial deposit, they'll bonus you 150% up to $2,500. How about them apples?